It seems clear that some people didn't quite understand the issue at hand in my last video. The issue I am addressing is not the question of standards for property acquisition. It is a question of the scope of power mandated by ownership, regardless of how it is acquired.
Well, that's nice, but Spock was talking about both, and I was talking about both. So no, Spock and I understood the issue just fine, thank you very much.
I am not addressing the question of what norm for property acquisition and maintenance makes the most sense. A theory of property rights does not necessarily simply entail a standard for acquisition, but it also could entail standards having to do with the relationship between ownership and power. What I am objecting to are standards of property rights that imply a questionable scope of power over other people as an extension of the ownership claim. To simply focus on the matter of acquisition and maintenance is to miss the point.
Right, and we didn't simply focus on acquisition, thus we did not miss the point, right? We did not miss the point. You're wrong.
The problem here that I have with at least the standard versions of anarcho-capitalism is that it reductionistically focuses on the question of acquisition. For example, the love it or leave it defense of the state is only countered on the grounds that the state did not acquire the land by the legitimate standard. This is fair enough, but by itself this seems to imply that it would be legitimate if it did require the land by the legitimate standard. In other words, this particular case against the state is at best necessary but insufficient because its very own standard of legitimacy can be used to justify the same thing.
Okay, first off, if we can say that the state did not legitimately acquire land, then that would be enough if someone opposes anything that is not legitimate. And legitimacy is just an idea. So let's lose the word legitimacy for the sake of clarity and just use support, right? The state exists because people support the state. And because of this support, the state can hire an army to use force at the margins. However, the state is a giant extortion racket, which is out of line with people's preferences. You can call this a moral opposition if you want, but then you go down the rabbit hole of trying to prove morality. Right? It would just say that the state is a giant extortion racket, and this is out of line with people's preferences. The idea of a state as well, and the intention of a state is also utopian. Right? It is disutilitarian. Right? And I'm not using utilitarian in a moral sense. I'm using it in an economic sense. And so with these 2 points, right, the state is disutilitarian, right, and it's an extortion racket which goes against people's preferences, and I guess you could say that's also a subset of being disutilitarian, that people don't like extortion rackets. But anyway, with those 2 points, we can argue against the state. Now, perhaps you do have a point as to what ownership entails, but you're wrong on this, right? Pointing out the utopian nature and non-standard acquisition of property, right, i.e. extortion racket, that states engage in, is sufficient.
It does not go far enough in that it does not principally object to the kind of authority associated with the state. It therefore appears superficial insofar as it only objects to the state on the grounds that it didn't acquire land properly.
No. There are also lots of ANCAPs arguing against the efficiency of the state. In fact, that is what most debates are about. That's the bulk of the matter, is how good the state is at making people's lives better. ANCAPs say not good at all.
Hence, the anarcho-capitalist is often prone to a sense of hypocrisy in which they themselves support the notion of love it or leave it on the condition of a land acquisition norm. The main argument against charges of their own paradigm devolving into the state is to simply repeat that the state as we know it didn't acquire land consistently with their property acquisition norms.
Right, that's a decent argument. If Bob farmed a plot of land for a year, and Jim pissed on a spot in the middle of that same acre and proclaimed his ownership of all the land that Bob was farming on, I would say that Bob has a more legitimate claim than Jim. And yes, legitimacy is subjective. Again, people support the state, Thus, the state exists because property comes from belief, and the state is just a property claim, right? It's a really stupid one, and it's a really disutilitarian one, but it is a property claim, right? That's why ANCAPs are out there trying to change what people support by putting forward a more consistent property acquisition criteria.
But this is irrelevant to the main concern here.
Right, and you are incorrect. That's an important thing to not overlook. What you said was irrelevant, yes, but it was also incorrect, right? Incorrect. You were wrong.
The main concern here is about power relations, not property acquisition. The concern is that the anarcho-capitalist view either endorses, is indifferent to, or unintentionally implies an excessive authority claim over other people as an extension of ownership. The closest thing that some anarcho-capitalists have to qualify this is some sort of proportionality principle. But that only addresses the question of violent punishment. It does not address the more general concern about subordination being endorsed as an implication of one's theory of property rights.
Vagueness, thy name is brain police. If you're driving a car and someone pisses on your... Okay, I'm sorry, I'm using all these pee arguments. I have to pee. If someone pees on the hubcap of your car that you're driving, would it be authoritarian to use force to get them to stop peeing on your car? Well, authoritarian is subjective, all right? I'd say it's a broken word, but I'm going to put words in your mouth and say that you believe that some force can be used to get someone to stop peeing on your car. How much force? Can you put a bullet in his head? Well, I would not condone that, and I don't think you would condone that either. So, how much force? Now, my answer is simple and consistent with everything else I have said. That is for the market to decide how much force can be used. And subordination is a matter of force, and how much one can subordinate others, what he can get other people to do on his property, and how much force he can use for this is something to be decided by a market, right? In the same way prices are decided by market, and different standards will emerge for different folks in different areas.
It should begin to become clear why I claim that anti-authoritarianism, as I understand it, is more robust in its conception of freedom. In a thick libertarian anarchist context, anti-authoritarianism takes issue with the exploitation of people that could be said to result from power dynamics above and beyond having concerns about physical aggression. It is not reductionistic. It is broader in the scope of what it critiques than standard anarcho-capitalism is. It is conscious of the fact that so-called voluntary relations lose a lot of weight when the circumstances limit people's options and when power is concentrated.
Vagueness, platitudes. What is power? What is a power relation? What is exploitation? And is exploitation something to be opposed? If you're saying that individuals shouldn't get in abusive relationships, or that parents shouldn't be able to do absolutely anything to their children, and that there's a limit to, and that's like a limit of the ownership of their house, or contextual ownership of the children, then fine. But now you're getting into the specifics of what ownership would entail / what you think it should entail. Okay, that's a whole other debate and another thing to talk and ask questions about. But I don't know if this is what you're talking about or what anarcho-capitalists you're talking about, because you're so fucking vague. Alright, you're vague in what authoritarian means, and you're vague in who your criticism applies to. When you say ANCAP, do you mean Spock? Do you mean Stefan Molyneux? Do you mean Walter Block? Do you mean Hans Hermann Hoppe? All these people call themselves anarcho-capitalists.
Relative to these standards, anarcho-capitalism simply shifts authoritarianism into a new property paradigm.
What standards? Exploitation, power imbalances, and how would you even know if they shifted into a new property paradigm if we haven't even defined what ownership entails?
As long as power is acquired in conjunction with the standards of its property theory, it must be said to be legitimate by its own terms.
No, ownership is always conditional because ownership is just a belief, right? An intersubjective consensus. Right? And what a person can do with property is regulated by how much the people around them will put up with it. And this regulation will be unimpeded if there is no state. I'm saying people should determine the criteria and the extent of ownership without reference to bugaboos. This includes the idea of a secular state, right? The United States, Canada, okay, the church, right, or the shadow of the church, that is, morality, right? Those are the three big bugaboos that leads to the criteria and extent of ownership being fucked up, right? The state, the church, and the shadow of the church.
The only way in which it can get away with claiming to not devolve into a state is by insisting on a definition of the state that is approached through the lens of its property norms. Without explicitly stating it in the terms that I just have, Spock concedes precisely this point in the video that I responded to. The main difference is that most of the nihilist anarcho-capitalist subgroup that he is a part of openly admit to not objecting to authoritarianism, without necessarily admitting that this makes their ideology rather self-defeating. If one is going to openly proclaim that one's particular conception of anarchism only differs from non-anarchism in terms of the exact same kind of power being predicated on different property norms, and to add insult to injury, that these property norms are just your personal preference that you cannot say are any better than any other, then it is hard to see why anyone that meaningfully questions power is going to be convinced by one's position. If it cannot qualitatively differentiate itself from what it claims to oppose, then it is self-defeating.
That's beautiful, BP. Hey, your body is symmetrical, right? You're carbon-based. You take in oxygen and use it for stuff. You break down carbohydrates and use them to make energy. Looking at all these facts, you must be a kangaroo. You openly admit that you are made of the same stuff as a kangaroo. It's just a different arrangement. If you cannot qualitatively distinguish yourself from a kangaroo, then I don't see how anyone can take your claims of not being a kangaroo seriously. God, you're so dumb, Brain Police. You're just plain unintelligent. Property claims are maintained primarily by belief and then force at the margins. The state is a certain kind of property claim, but it's a very stupid and abusive one that comes from a belief in a bugaboo. All right, in this case, it's a belief in the United States federal government. Right? You don't need to replace this with some other bugaboo. You don't need to replace this with morality, with the shadow of the church.